Thompson. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard. And I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I specialize in the study of religion, specifically the study of religion in North Africa, and more specifically Islam. So this year is a postdoctoral year. So I've previously taught. I taught for 2 years as a visiting assistant professor, 1 year at Boston University. And so this year I've really just been doing research. And I've been doing research specifically looking at hate speech and blasphemy cases in the Western Mediterranean. So looking at cases in North Africa, which was the topic of my dissertation, more specifically blasphemy cases in Tunisia. I've kind of expanded that research out, so the hate speech and blasphemy cases are in Tunisia, but also Morocco, Spain, and France. The paper that I'm presenting at CURA this year looks at a blasphemy case that I have previously studied that took place in Tunisia in the post-Arab Spring moment, so in 2012. And in this case, a number of artists who participated in an art exhibit that was in part funded by the Ministry of Culture or supported by the Ministry of Culture, a number of artists were prosecuted for blasphemy. In particular, I focus on the case of one artist who created a kind of installation in which he depicted a young boy carrying a backpack, and out of this backpack emerged bodies of ants. And the bodies of the ants were used to spell Subhanallah, an Arabic expression meaning glory to God. And specifically, this particular artist was singled out in a complaint sent to the public prosecutor by a prominent notary, a prominent kind of conservative Muslim notary. And the notary deemed this particular installation blasphemous because the word Allah or God appeared under the word Subhan or glory to. And he said that Allah should always be above the word Subhan. So that is the first case that my article looks at. And then my article compares this particular case to a Spanish blasphemy case. And the Spanish blasphemy case is from 2015. It also involves kind of a local artist, so Tunisian artists, Spanish artists. These are not people coming from other kind of national contexts, but they are, right, living and working in the context where they end up getting prosecuted. And this particular artist was raised in the Catholic Church and has used a number of different installations to talk about things or to criticize religion, also to talk about queerness or sexual identity. And in the installation for which this artist was prosecuted, though not ultimately found guilty for blasphemy, the artist gathered actually consecrated communion wafers from a number of Catholic churches in the area where he was living. He gathered 242 communion wafers. And he used these to spell out the word pederasty, so, right, sexual abuse of children. And he photographed himself naked alongside these communion wafers, spelling out the word pederasty. And this was, as we could guess, a means for him for criticizing the Spanish Catholic Church, or the larger Catholic Church. 242 is actually the number of sexual abuse against minor cases that had occurred over the past decade in northern Spain, which is where he got that number. So I compare these two cases in a number of ways, and I'll just mention a few. One, I think, really interesting feature of both of these cases is that both artists that I'm looking at, right, young-ish men who are kind of iconoclasts, who disagree with what they perceive of as the majoritarian embrace of religion. Both of them were initially prosecuted but never actually found guilty of blasphemy. Both of them also went into exile for short periods of time and then returned to their respective countries. And I'm particularly interested in making this comparison. This is in line with kind of a larger arc of my work in the sense that we often, I think, over the past, the very least probably 30 or 40 years, have talked about blasphemy as a particularly Muslim problem. There's actually a foreign policy piece from the 2010s that made that argument in its headline, blasphemy is a Muslim problem. And so there hasn't been a lot of work on European blasphemy cases. Many people, and I think also scholars, anticipate that most European blasphemy cases, so blasphemy cases specifically against often Christianity, would be probably from the previous century, if not earlier. And in fact, what I've become really interested in looking at, and what I look at partially in this article, but is also part of the larger project that I'm undertaking this year, is looking at the recent blasphemy prosecutions that we have in Spain. And so this would be one of those. This paper is a very small part of a larger project that I'm doing this year at the Weatherhead Center, which looks at blasphemy prosecutions, again, not only in Tunisia, which is what I've researched previously, and in Morocco, so these would be Muslim majority contexts, but also in Europe in what we could call Christian majority contexts, so Spain and France. Also former colonial powers in North Africa. So a project that brings together blasphemy cases from post-colonial contexts and the context of the former colonizers. And I'm also really interested then in looking at these blasphemy cases in relation to hate speech cases in the same context. And the basis of comparison for these hate speech and blasphemy cases is affective injury. And so something that I noticed looking closely at blasphemy cases in Tunisia, which is the argument of my current book project that focuses on blasphemy cases in Tunisia from the 19th century through basically the present day, is that blasphemy has been historically framed as an affective crime, as a crime that creates something that we sometimes call moral injury, and we other times call hurt feelings. And so we see people from, like in the mid-19th century in Tunisia saying blasphemy is really dangerous because it makes people really upset. And when people get really upset, it destabilizes public order. And so I've been interested then in comparing this affective framing of blasphemy, which I've absolutely seen in the Tunisian context, but which is also very clear in the Spanish context, in which it is actually against the law to offend a religious believer's sentiments. So we have kind of an explicit legal framing in Spain. We do not have that in Tunisia, but we certainly have the same kind of popular framing by officials in charge, that recourse to the affective, to the destabilizing power of hurt feelings we find in the contemporary and historical Tunisian context. And so I've become really interested then in comparing blasphemy cases to hate speech cases, because much of the pro-hate speech legislation has focused on the deleterious effects of hurt feelings, particularly among minority groups in the European context. And so we actually see a very similar articulation of why hate speech is dangerous. Often legal scholars will say hate speech hurts, the feelings of, often in the European context, Muslim minority groups. It makes them feel denigrated, and that those feelings of denigration discourage their participation in the democratic process. And so, though the kind of end result is slightly different, we see a very similar framing in hate speech cases where proponents of the curbing of hate speech or the criminalization of hate speech say we need to protect democracy, and in order to protect democracy, we need to protect the feelings of citizens. We need to protect particularly minority groups from bad feelings that may discourage them from participating in this thing that we have called democracy. So I guess the genesis of this project, the reason that I got really interested in studying blasphemy in the first case was because I was living in Tunisia during the late 2010, early 2011 uprising, so what we now call kind of the Arab Spring uprisings that started in Tunisia. And I was kind of back and forth between the United States and Tunisia, and then I spent several years subsequently in Tunisia. And so I was, very much present for the post-Arab Spring moment that was characterized by what people have called a discursive explosion, where many people were speaking and they had not previously been able to speak, and people were having public debates or political debates on Facebook. Candidates were appearing on kind of live television streams, presenting their platforms. There was just it was a real moment of enthusiasm, and it was also a real moment of, I think, backlash and disappointment. People kind of pushing the envelope, trying out things that they had not been able to do before as they were living under a dictatorship. Then kind of other people trying to use specifically the legal system to curb this kind of previously unheard speech or previously very repressed speech. And so one of the things that I saw the legal system doing was curbing speech that was pushing the envelope too far on kind of decentralizing the place of Islam, so in Tunisian society. And so basically people who were at the very least seen as promoting a particular secularist discourse. And I guess what the genesis of the project then was for me began at a seafood restaurant in southern Tunisia, where I was visiting a friend of a friend who was studying pharmacy in southern Tunisia. And we were all having dinner, and we started talking about a recent blasphemy case in which an individual had actually thrown copies of the Quran into the toilets of mosques. So if you can imagine like a blasphemous act, that is a really blasphemous act. Like it is, copies of the Quran, very holy text, not just desecrating them, right? And like maybe by tearing them or something, but actually throwing them into a toilet, and not just any toilet, but the toilet of a mosque, and not just, one mosque, but it was like 3 different mosques and their toilets. So it was in many ways an incredibly provocative act. And so we were talking about this particular blasphemy case over dinner, and one of the people present who identified as a kind of strongly anti-Islamist individual. So basically was very opposed to the rise or the return of Muslim conservatives, otherwise called Islamists, who have a political project, Muslim conservatives with a political project. So she was opposed to their return to the state. And at the same time that she was very strongly anti-Islamist, she also endorsed or approved of the punishment of this particular young man. And that surprised me. It was a little bit of a puzzle. I had expected her to be critical of this particular prosecution, but she was not. And so that kind of sent me down a road of thinking about, what had I missed in this context? Why had I assumed erroneously that she would not be bothered by this? But it also led me down a path where I started thinking about, what are the things that I maybe care about, and I only find out that I care about them when they are challenged. There are many contexts, I think, in which this happens, in which we discover suddenly, and this is probably why I'm interested in hate speech and blasphemy in relation to religious studies, but we discover that we care about something because suddenly someone has denigrated it or threatened it. We weren't necessarily sure before that we cared about it, but we discover kind of in that moment, and sometimes it surprises us. I was just reading an amicus brief that was filed by a European organization that's a conservative kind of Christian organization, an amicus brief that they had sent to the European Court of Human Rights. And they opened their amicus brief in a really interesting way, saying this work that Abul Ascona has undertaken, this kind of installation using consecrated communion wafers, this is part of a pattern. We've seen that the Spanish state has been interrupting masses, stopping masses for no reason to do with public order, that there have been cross burnings, that generally this is part of a decline of Christianity in Spain, which is quite interesting because I think that, it would be possible to make a different argument about how Christianity is still a very important, at the very least, structuring sensibility in Spain or in Spanish law, even in Spanish public life, in the public sphere. And this amicus brief opened with the exact opposite argument. This is part of a much larger story, a pattern of Christian decline, right? Of course, it's a pattern of a particular kind, a decline of a particular kind of Christianity, right? One other really interesting thing that I'll mention between these two cases, so this contemporary Spanish blasphemy case, this contemporary Tunisian blasphemy case, both are about art, right? And what I think is super interesting in these particular cases is that art is necessarily multivocal. Right, an artist makes a piece of art and then I encounter it and I think it means something, but then sometimes I read the plaque and I realize, oh no, the plaque says actually this art means something different. Which meaning is authoritative, right? We often imagine the plaque meaning to be authoritative, but sometimes artists will say, people made something even more interesting out of my art than I had anticipated. And the life of a piece of art, right, extends far beyond the control of the artist. And so what we see in these blasphemy cases is a lot of different people trying to make sense of a piece of art. And artists are able to, in many senses, take advantage of the multivocality of art, its openness to multiple interpretations by, for example, at court or in an interview with police saying, or an investigating magistrate saying, oh no, that's not at all what I intended. I did not mean for that particular piece of art to be read in this blasphemous way. And something that I think is incredibly interesting in relation to my kind of this bigger question that I have about emotion and the purchase of speaking from a position of affective injury, right? When someone says, my feelings have been hurt, there's a certain urgency there. There's a necessity to kind of stop the hurt before kind of addressing maybe the larger contextual questions, which can kind of fade into the background. But often these artists will harness the power of affect, and they will point to the fact that much of the art that they produce comes from a position or a situation of affective intention and intensity, and often affective injury. And so artists themselves will say, my art hurt you? Well, this art came out of affective hurt that I had. And we see in the Spanish and Tunisian blasphemy case concerning artists, we see that happen because affect is very powerful, right? Speaking out of kind of emotion, speaking of emotional urgency is incredibly powerful. And in some ways, it's a way of stopping the conversation, I think, and I'm really interested in how that operates across various contexts, and I'm looking really particularly at how it works here. I love the setup of CURA. We have people who are coming from many different disciplines that often don't speak to one another. So anthropology, political science, history, global studies, right? Coming together, circulating a paper that they've written in advance, and then gathering and giving feedback to the author. And what I think is really, really nice about that model is that I read things that come from far outside my discipline, that talk about this thing that I think is really important, religion. And I come to every session with a number of thoughts, right? How can the paper be better? What does the paper do really well? What questions do I have? Like, what other information do I need to understand the argument that the author's trying to make? But then I'm always really amazed by the things that other people are able to see in a paper or suggest other directions to take the research, how to make a paper more coherent. All of us are academics, so we are all always trying to publish, right? And so I learned so much, not really just from reading the papers. Of course, I learned a lot from that, but I actually learned probably even more from hearing from other people how they might restructure a paper, or how they think an argument could be stronger, or other kind of thinkers to put kind of the data from the article in conversation with. I learned an enormous amount from that. So I would say just the very model of CURA facilitates a kind of learning that I think, to be honest, is even better than the kind of learning that I was able to do as a grad student.